So yes, no question, you're really done?
I'm an engineer. 80% is done.
Okay. No, I meant with your comments now. Okay.
Yes, I'm done. Oh, yeah.
You're done. Okay. She's really done, Andrew? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much. I think on behalf of the committee, we're going to have questions, of course, but I think the presentations and the intensity with which you've addressed our questions has been very useful, very informative, and of course is exactly what we need to write the report responding to our statement of task. I actually have one truly simple yes/no question: is the handbook completely done?
No.
Okay.
Would you like to hear?
Then there may be a follow-up.
Would you like? I can tell you the status.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the systematic review methods, I would say, are done. This issue about sort of how do we characterize non-cancer, that's not done. And so Andrew and Barbara have been reaching out. So we heard, as we indicated yesterday, we heard a variety of opinions, everything from use descriptors, don't use descriptors, and those were not easily resolved. And so what Andrew and Barbara have been doing is this very targeted outreaches to the different offices and sort of understanding more what could be acceptable to find sort of a common ground. So I believe, Andrew, that the current status is, I think he's got maybe 2 options that we want to go back to the agency and share. And then that would be sort of the last thing. I think the comments at this point that we're getting on the handbook, and we've also shared a template protocol, are really more clarifications. We're not finding deal breakers. So what we want to do is either we'll find out whether one of these options are acceptable, and then that will go into the handbook. If we find out that we're still not there, then we just want to publish it as is. We've said it's evergreen. What we're finding out from our users is that not surprisingly, they need to see examples. And so again, we might just sort of have a parking lot for having finality on how do we call refer to the non-cancer hazard pending development of examples. So we want to get it out no matter what happens, one way or the other. It would go through another round of agency comments. There's a lot of interest in the handbook. We would do a briefing for other agencies and then post it.
And then just one other more general question. The 2014 report recognized that there'd be a transition from, we'll call it IRIS 1.0 to IRIS 2.0, and there were, of course, assessments in progress, and one commenter pointed out. But at what point, when you feel your processes are, quote, stable, would you say that you will, be ready to produce your first IRIS 2.0 assessment? In other words, how close are you to that point?
Well, I think that, certainly like chloroform, uranium, all these assessment plans are going to be start to scratch everything you've heard. I think a number of the other assessments that are in progress will be this as well. That's what Tina was alluding to, that in some cases, when we felt that assessment wasn't going to sort of be able to sort of meet the standards of what we've outlined, we've asked the teams to go back and do things.
Simply put, we won't be releasing anything anymore. That's not 2.0.
Yeah, and so, but we were sort of lucky. So for those assessments that were underway, typically the part of the systematic review in terms of the literature identification was solid. So it was really trying to sort of make sure that the bias assessment matches the current practices, that they have these tabular summaries of how they got to their confidence conclusions.
Thank you. Dave?
So my questions relate to the handbook as well. So you've shown us examples in which you're already operationalizing the handbook. So eventually, where do you see the value added for us as a committee to understand the handbook? What it's going to add if we actually had it in front of us? If we saw the draft of the handbook like we did in 2014 or just the final version, how do you think our view of or evaluation of IRIS would look different?
Honestly, we wrestled with that as well, especially as we move to our portfolio approach. You could argue that it's not going to cover every assessment anymore. But I think the value added is that, one, it's it's also sort of for EPA staff and contractors. So it has a lot of information about accessing HERO, how you sort of think about quality assurance with contractors, timelines, internal timelines. So it has that value. And because it's been so visible, we're thinking, well, we've sort of expected to post it. I think also when you look at the chloroform protocol, it's 50 or 60 pages, in part because we couldn't refer to C methods in the handbook. So it's possible if we find that there are sections of the protocol that are distractingly long and boilerplate, and the handbook is posted, we may be able to just point to it. Yeah.
I would also say one of the other things that the handbook provides is specific examples. It provides more examples of when you're applying these kind of basic practices, what are other things you want to think about, and putting it into, context we have from drafting past assessments, more specifically, and examples of how this is useful in others. It has been useful in other situations. So I think those examples are really useful to the user. Maybe not as useful to the NAS panel, but at least for the user, those examples can provide a lot of information for how to move forward on your assessment.
Maybe a follow-up to that, then there's like this formal handbook that's going to undergo a lot of review, but there's also, say, what I call work documents in which you're kind of capturing EPA's best practices. So to what extent do you have that type of a, kind of FAQ, like frequent questions, and for the assessors to be able to follow, and just how do you capture your best practices outside of the handbook?
Not outside, yeah, I think it's in the handbook, basically.
What?
Yeah. Within the IRIS program, I would say it would be in our handbook, but I think also we're finding out that through that agency-wide communities of practice, that there's interest in sort of having this kind of, not necessarily sort of one document that fits all, but things like, can we develop a place where we can understand which tools are the latest and greatest? So some of that is coming through the communities of practice, but not like a codified document that covers the whole agency.
So you can anticipate the handbook to really kind of capture that information and keeping it evergreen then, correct?
So Tina wanted to just move away from the handbook, because to me the protocols were already doing that. But it became clear that it is a useful SOP. It's not a guideline document. It's not, risk assessment world, do it this way. But we're really mostly using it as an SOP and as a way, as a framework to continue in an evergreen way to update our most bestest of best practices that are common, especially things that are commonly informative. So that's how we're using it, which is why we didn't expect such strong reactions to the descriptor language, because the descriptors were perfectly fit within the IRIS framework, but because they were being interpreted as sort of guidance, it reached a little bit of a sort of a tense environment. So that's how we're trying to sort of do this surgical outreach to make sure that people understand what the domain of applicability of the handbook is.
Yeah, and I guess I would say the best practices is a really narrow how we're operationalizing systematic review within the IRIS program, not best practices in EPA, which is our guidelines, obviously, but it's how we operationalize systematic review in IRIS and still maintaining our adherence to those guidance documents.
Okay, George?
So we've heard and saw yesterday lots of great examples of research in the program and to develop methods and that's very appropriate, particularly in response to some of the earlier recommendations that you got. But I guess what I'm wondering is, do you have a feel for the relative weight that you're going to put in terms of FTEs or whatever effort into the research versus the actual doing going forward? And is there a way, or have you already done the capturing of the necessary ongoing research and methods development and the whole portfolio management that you share with the rest of the agency?
So we're just launching that process. So actually, Bruce Roden is leading the effort across ORD. All the programs are going to be doing this, is sort of revisioning in the context of the resources and the administrator's priorities, what is that space going to look like? So in HHRA specifically, we completely are revamping the program, whereas where the conduct of an assessment is going to be basically our primary objective. So while there will be a lot of research efforts, they have to be housed within the conduct of an assessment. So it can't be, so no one's going to be doing 100% just research if it is not tied to and anchored. And so all the BMD work anchored within the conduct of the assessments, all the epidemiology anchored. So it's going to be that level of anchoring. So a lot of what Jason talked about is going to be applied in our assessments of emerging contaminants like the perfluorinated. So it's that kind of anchoring. That's one half of the topic area. And the other half of the topic area where we are and will be devoting a lot of resources is the translational aspect, is to make sure, and that's the feedback we got from our SAB, don't go running and leave the rest of the risk assessment community behind. So it's you're either in this inner club or you're out. So we're and Alan Stern said it. Don't create a new swim lane that's or highway lane. So we are also taking a lot of our FTE. For example, Chris has a collaboration with the Department of Defense on building this pipeline of systematic review. There's going to be a full-day retreat coming up in a week. People are going to be off-ramp to invest in that, invest in understanding how are our practices same, different, and what would the bridging function be? What does the world is going to have to interpret a federal assessment that uses systematic review, but if they're divergent or convergent or why? So that takes FTE away, but we think those are important investments, and we're going to be making those investments. And then a lot of effort in onboarding the new data streams, new methods, and not just ToxCast and Tox21, but the toxicogenomic data that's coming. There's a lot of investment. So we're engaged in helping to design what's going to be needed to map the data, traditional, new, and all the stuff in between, to build it into this confidence building exercise. Because we're learning that if NCEA doesn't engage in that, if the risk assessment authorities don't engage in that process, it'll flounder. We need to inform what is it going to take for the risk assessors to use the data and what are the vulnerabilities. So that's the other stream of true sort of research. I'd say that those are the three: the translation side, the informing the assessment or strengthening the assessment side, and then all the new alt method stuff is pretty much.
And let me just add to the FTE. I would say, so the systematic review working group and then our sort of our tool trainers, that's probably about a group of, 8 to 10 folks. So I see that they're really sort of engaged in some of these international cross-agency state engagements. And so they often sort of hold these. So that would sort of be the FTE repository on the systematic review automation side. I mentioned that we have very strong relationships with NTP on promoting the semi-automation approaches. So in that sense, we're expanding our FTE pool by working with them. Another example is we have, through our MOU with NIOSH, we have Matt Wheeler, who's sort of an expert in dose response methods. He's a methods guy. So he's got an office now in the EPA and in RTP. So we're trying to use our MOUs in addition to FTEs to sort of increase our bandwidth.
And John Bucher,
Yes, and John Bucher. So actually, John Bucher, as you may know, sort of recently retired from his position, but he's still in the government. And so we've mentioned this ToxPath working group that is sort of a disciplinary work group that thinks about how do you think about mechanistic data. He's co-chairing that. So we've got somebody very seasoned to help mentor. We've got a lot of newer staff who are incredibly promising. And so I like the combination of having somebody like John Bucher with all his experience helping to mentor our younger staff along and think about how do we bridge across the different evidence streams.
Richard?
So I want to ask a question that's not necessarily specific to IRIS, but more the field itself that IRIS is really a part of. But first of all, let me thank you for an incredible energy that you've put into making this process more transparent, more systematic, all good. So what I want to focus on is the idea of how we can incorporate, or how you think we might incorporate, feedback as time goes on into the system. So let me make a comparison so you'll sort of get what I'm talking about. In the mid-20th century, in economics, the Cowles Commission and other efforts just ramped up the sophistication mathematically and all other ways about economic models to a completely different level. And, there was no question that the models they were developing were more beautiful, more sophisticated, used state-of-the-art techniques. And then what happened was quite interesting. The predictions they made about the U.S. economy were worse than chance. And it came that way again and again and again. And so the sophistication that they added didn't help at all in the underlying true goal of the idea, which was to actually predict the future, right? So, and the same thing in some sense happened with early climate modeling, right? The early climate models were just worse than chance, and then they got better and better and better, and so did the economics models because they actually had feedback. They could look at their predictions, and they could change how they actually made the predictions depending on what happened. So I guess what I'm asking is, how can we get that to happen in this field? You're facing this incredibly difficult problem, which is you have very limited data, right, and very limited information in general about lots of chemicals, and you have to make some kind of an assessment about what the risk really is in humans. And as time goes on, more evidence comes in, and we can get some feedback, although I'm not sure how to do it, about how well your understanding or your assessment of the risk, right, predicts what we find when the evidence comes in later. So what I'd like to know is thoughts on how we can use what happens in the future to feed back on how well you're actually doing in predicting, right, what the future evidence is going to show.
That's a very good question, because so risk assessment, at least when it's done in the agency, is part of a system of decision making, right? It's not a standalone, it's not an ivory tower experience by any means, right? So once that number is rendered, it creates a cascade of decisions. You heard that from the stakeholders, right? Their industry, their communities are impacted by these things. So there's not a natural way where you can revisit these things and decide if you're doing. So there's always ways to be doing better, but not a lot of ways to pull back, right? There's not a natural pipeline for constant recalibration. So we'll have to think about what would be the way to do that that wouldn't be disruptive to the risk management community. But certainly the peer review process, the public consultation process, and the very early public consultation that Chris is trying to set up is the best place to do course correction. It's a lot harder to do it after the fact. Not that it shouldn't be done if it's needed, but I'm just saying it's a lot harder.
Yeah, and I guess that just to add, I think that prior to implementing something that's very different, we often sort of want to have pilot examples or case studies. They're not always simplistic, certainly. But I would think that when you got a sense that a certain new approach that you tried wasn't working, I don't know if it would be hard to pull back on. I mean, I think at the chemical assessment level, it could be updates to the protocol or...
But I think this is more than that. This is more that you did all these things and in the end it didn't make a difference.
Yeah.
So, and we need the community to help us assess that, but earlier would be better, which is why I think the publishing of the protocols, the keeping the protocol on our website evergreen until the assessment draft is developed, and welcoming that feedback would be sort of one of the ways to do it.
Well, just to follow up for a second, I agree that it's great to have the public or whomever involved in the early to give you feedback on what's happened.
Right.
But I was thinking more along the lines of, suppose you're changing the process. Systematic review is adopted much more systematically. and then suppose, we do 3 or 4 assessments, and then it turns out in, 20 years' time, right, we have much more evidence on these chemicals, and it turns out that your assessment for 2 of the cases was dead on in a certain sense, and then for 2 of them it was completely terrible. The evidence was very, very different, it turns out. So my question is, how can we use what happens in the future to feed back into your process for making a prediction about what sorts of evidence we're going to see when we get it? because obviously lead is a good case, right? We knew
Yeah.
so little about lead in 1980, and now we know so much.
Right.
Right? But the people who did the work in 1980 were reasonably accurate.
Right.
Even though there was a lot of controversy about it, they had very little data, and they had to be very, very risky in a certain sense about making the assessment.
Yeah, a lot to think about, and we're not averse. That's why we're also doing. You've heard before, and now even more formally, these updates that we're also going to be doing, because we too have the sense that especially the explosion in biology alone is really changing a lot of the dynamics, some for the better and some not, right? So we're paying attention, and I think we'll have to figure out how to operationalize that. I have to confess we haven't. We've not been in the fortunate place of having done so much that now we can afford to look back, but maybe we'll get there.
I think some of it could be possible, and just to sort of think about the systematic review approaches in particular. So in one sense, a question that's come up is, am I really going to end up with a different conclusion if I use systematic review? And I'm not sure you will. It might be more transparent, right? And I think the standards in the field are like the train has left the station. I think you can't sort of pull back and think that your more artesian narrative approach is going to cut it. But I do agree with what Danielle said, was when you actually have done a few, because there's so much focus on what's the decision-making context and the evidence, it is more efficient. So you might not, your answer might not have changed, but I think you probably will have got there a bit faster once people understand the methodologies and you get past the learning curve. And I also think that when you think about the structure frameworks and thinking about your confidence, so the flip is, if I have high confidence in the conclusion, what I'm saying is I don't really think more research is going to change that.
Right.
And you could probe that.
Yes. That's actually probably was the best answer, yeah.
Maybe as a general comment, Karen, you may want to comment here. I mean, it seems what you're struggling with is pretty generic in the sense that there are many fields, and you talked about advances in science, where we're able to generate an awful lot of data that we think will be useful for making decisions. So-called precision medicine is a great example in terms of whether it's helping make people healthier or not, and we're solving situations of decision-making around individuals. Have to know, and Karen may want to speak to this, but colleagues of hers at Hopkins and elsewhere are dealing with this general issue of rigor and reproducibility across biomedical research in general, and there's been a lot of discussion about principles and software and how you track. So I think it's this movement is actually quite parallel. You're sort of a specific example of what I think is going on more broadly, where, we're now looking for these trails of where do we get data, how do we use it, and whether the decision-making context is regulatory or somebody sitting with a doc. So, no comment. Am I correct? Yes. Say yes. Okay. All right. But it's true. Okay, Rick.
Well, thanks. So I'm going to get back to a question on training. Yesterday the focus was on the systematic reviews and evaluation, all that, and it became really apparent about where the training was and what kind of a culture change that can create. So to give a chance at this morning's session to kind of go that step further, because it was a much shorter session, what degree of training and shift on your domain experts, when you're actually where the rubber hits the road, you're making decisions on studies you're advancing, your dose response analysis, the concepts of model averaging and Bayesian approaches. Can you comment about the training on that and the culture shift that's going to occur? Because, for some domain experts, these are foreign territories. It's a whole different language. They don't understand basically the nuances and assumptions built in the models. And when you start to average them, what does that mean? And I do know that with the benchmark dose software has entrenched, but now we're talking at a whole nother level of modeling. So where are you at with the training and the shift in culture so that people understand these tools that they're using, why they should be used, and how that's going to go forward?
So I would say that the reason benchmark dose modeling is entrenched is because we had a very consistent and persistent training approach. We've provided training to states, to industry, within the agency, and we did that at the behest of, different groups. We also, went to the top of the mountain and screamed as loudly as we could about the approach. And there's not anything that's not going to change just because we're implementing these newer methods. We are going to provide training at conferences. We're going to provide training when anybody comes to us. We're going to proactively go to different parts of the agency and other stakeholders and say, hey, we have this new tool. We think it will be very beneficial to you to use it. So, when I came to the agency and started giving training with Jeff, we would invariably have somebody in the background going, well, why can't I use the no-AL, low-AL approach? I've been using it for 15 years. And now nobody says that because we've very persistently pointed out why BMD modeling is, methodologically better than the no-AL, low-AL approach, and it lets you leverage more data than that approach. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to get the message out why model averaging is better than our previous model selection frameworks. We're going to get the message out why meta-regression, if you can do it for epi studies or tox studies, is better than picking the best model or the best study to base all your risk derivations on.
Okay, so have you developed more of a timeline and a plan moving forward to how you're going to implement that and train staff?
I don't know that we have a plan. It is, as we implement new tools, we implement the training alongside that.
Okay.
Like just for example, when did you brief the roundtable? Was it last week?
2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago. So basically, it became clear that, especially with the alternatives modules that were being developed, that even across sort of the leadership of NCEA, there may not be, the scientists were using it, but the leadership may not be aware of what everybody was talking about. So Jeff and Alan did a briefing, showed the new modules, and explained why there was a sort of additional level of effort going on. So do we have a structured plan for doing it? No, but it's, how much of our time do we spend developing plans or just doing things? So we have we do intense binging with the leadership of the organization. We hold, Mary Ross is now in the room in the back, our brilliant deputy who is adamant about this sort of consistency training opportunities, a lot of embedding. We do a lot of embedding within the organization and keeping this flow of knowledge going, not just in BMD or CAT-REG or a number of other tools, but even in just sort of this, the analysis that's required in risk analysis. Chris does a lot of sort of even one-on-one sitting with a lot of smaller groups. You've done even with some of senior and junior teams, sitting down and let's sort of look at how do we get here. So it's just a lot of human capital investment. I don't have a good way of describing it. Do we have a book on a shelf I can pull out and show you the schedule for it? No, but I can assure you that, I don't know, Jeff, you want to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to add that bringing the world into modeling dose response data took some time, and there was a transition period where we were actually doing hands-on training, and then we were able to put it on the webinar and do online training. Yeah. And I imagine we will get to that point faster now because I think that the world is more used to doing modeling of dose response data, and we're now just model averaging. There's the issue of priors that we've talked about, but I think we'll get to the point where we can, beyond hands-on training, actually have webinar training online.
And the problem is it's really infinite. So for example, when I came from my background to NC and I started looking at iris assessments and just the descriptors on the chemistry and what was going on, it became evident that they did not really, they were not aware of what Tony Williams is doing in the computational chemistry space and the chemistry dashboard that would have all the data they wanted at their fingertips. And that hadn't occurred. So we started bringing CompTox training into NCEA, not because all of those tools are immediately going to transform our space, but it's important for me, it's important, our scientists hear this from me every day. as risk assessors, it is incumbent upon us to be extremely familiar with the state of the science, even if we are not doing work, even if we can't read all the papers, but to know it's there, to know who the principles are, and to know where to reach out for help. So creating that culture of familiarity with all these things is a constant effort. It's just the challenge is the calendars. So as Jeff said, we start recording these webinars and making them available ad hoc as well, and that's very, very helpful. And then where things become operationalized, we try to feed it into the handbook. So it's a little bit of a kitchen cooking kind of way, but the kids learn to cook eventually. It does work.
I just wanted to add a little bit to the discussion. I was thinking about the benchmark dose, and I think Kenny Crump published his first paper in '84 or '86, and we had this nice workshop between industry and government in 1993, and Barnes et al. is the paper, and I'm proud of that. And in 2010, which was only 17 short years later, it became the standard for IRIS, and a lot of that is through efforts like Jeff's in terms of making the software available so that everyone was using a standard platform and really teaching people. But a lot of the 17 years was around institutional resistance and the failure of, I think, the leadership at the time to overcome that resistance. So it could be that you two are going to have to simply decide which things are going to be incorporated quickly, and then I think that the training will overcome the resistance. So it wasn't a question, but I just felt like
and I don't know,
it's one of those things.
I agree completely with you, but I don't know what happened, because when I came to ANSIA, and I think Chris will come, there's zero what we're hearing from the scientists is, thank God we're ready. Let's just go. I mean, there is not only no resistance, people are going up, they're each adopting a part of the organization and doing these sort of, so Emma Lavoie is not here today, but she's on the webinar. So she's opened the doors for us to these nooks and crannies in the organization, and everybody in the room has a pet family that they're engaged with. We've brought patrons. So to reduce our resistance, the only way we could do it is to have them come and live in our space. So in fact, right now, Chris is trying to recruit a brilliant scientist from Region 10 to come and sort of live with us for 120 days and sort of learn this experience. So that's the only way to do it, is to become infectious. And we're infectious, I think.
Okay, Ilyan.
I want to follow up on Dr. Corey's question on training, and I want to congratulate the agency for taking the approach of training the trainer in terms of systematic review. So my question is that, with respect to those response assessment, especially developing all these sophisticated modeling approach, does the agency see the needs, capacity, and do you have a plan to train the trainer? So really, so that's definitely not a yes no question. I have three components:
within our capacity,
needs, capacity, and a plan.
Yes, to all three.
To all three.
To all three. So it's a triple yes.
We can.
No, we are at all times willing to give training when it's asked, and we're willing to give training even when it's not, to be kind of flippant. I mean, we really try to get the message out that these are the approaches that we use, and these are how we use these approaches. And we don't, when we give BMD training, we're very careful to say this is how we do it. It's a sophisticated methodology, and there's not one universal true way to do it, but this is how we do it based on our guidelines and our experience in applying the methods. And that's not going to stop because we've developed meta-regression or Bayesian model averaging or meta-analysis for hazard identification. We're going to give the training when we are asked to give the training, and we're going to get the message out and say, if you want this training, come to us.
And you're moving stuff to the web-based also to perpetuate this trainer training.
Absolutely. So like when we give training at SRA now, it's primarily CAT-REG because we feel that the BMD training is mature enough. It's a webinar. We've got a quick start guide. People can go to the web and they can digest that training at their leisure. CAT-REG is a new software product we've put out in the last couple of years, and so we've kind of shifted our message to try to get that out into the community. And even beyond training, we've got lines of communication open within the software. So if people have a question about applying it, we have an e-ticket system. We also have BMDS support where, if people just have one person somewhere has a question about applying a model or applying a method, they can reach out to Jeff and I, and we're very responsive.
And we're focusing on BMD, but I don't know if Ryan's still here. We're doing this for HERO. We're doing this, so it's in all of the domains that, so the answer to your question of capacity, the need is there, the capacity is what it is. But we're devoting it to this.
Yeah, and you have to place a premium on it. Otherwise, you will never build the capacity. Right. Otherwise, if you can't train the community.
So we've done this across many of our domains now, and are kind of operationalizing it so it can, if it can be fit within the hours of a day, we'll do it.
Actually, I have a slightly different dimension on that question. That is, I view Alan, Jeff as the trainers. These trainers are developing new tools. Do they see the needs and the capacity to be trained? Let me be blunt. Do we have?
Do they need more training?
In terms of developing methods. That's the question.
Yeah, and I think you do, and
the capacity and the plan to do.
Okay, I'm going to punt questions on plan because all anyone ever asks NCO to do is to plan. I think we do now. We're done with so yes. I mean, you tell me, Liang, where does a person like Jeff or Alan go? Except in literature, scientific meetings, right? I mean, there's not like a shop out in Colorado, I can say. It goes across disciplines. It's very transdisciplinary, right? And my other issue is it has to have a risk assessment lens. There are a lot of academic trainings out there that have very little bearing on how you conduct risk assessment. So I have to marry those two. But when the opportunity comes up, whether it's here or in Italy, we'll do it. If it's useful, we have not said no to, if Mary will find the money, basically, that's the rule.
So I have to emphasize that Alan and I, we're not statisticians. We are on the statistical work group within EPA, but we are there because there are a number of statisticians there that can help us and advise us in how to do the training better, how to develop the software better, and there are also people that we can bring in from other agencies like Mac Wheeler who can help us to educate us. We have a risk assessment modeling team, RAM team, and half that team is government. One of them is a NIOSH person. The other half is contract at this point, but those contractors aren't involved in the training. We do all the training with our in-house resources, and we get the training when we need to from other government, from within SWG. We have great people there like Lanid and Karen Hogan, and so we have a lot of. It's not just us.
And that SWG is now co-chaired by an MD, for example, because that's the other thing is we don't want the modeling to become untethered from biology. That was the other issue, because modeling, statistical modeling, can be Oh my gosh, it's like an art form, right? So by bringing Jay Zhao into that leadership is to anchor it back to biology, to health, and make sure that we don't pursue modeling for the sake of modeling, because that's a big risk. You know, we're a big nerdy community here.
Okay, I think we've got this. Maybe a little off task. Karen.
This is not about training. So I've been trying to think about how to ask this question. I think if I could characterize a general type of question that's been asked yesterday and today, it's about at what point certain decisions are made in the process, how are those decisions made or on what basis they're made, and then how is that documented. And I guess in particular I'm interested in the decisions that are made after the protocol development, how those are documented. And then sort of a follow-up question to that is how you reconcile that with the definition of systematic review, which we saw, which seems like 2 weeks ago, but yesterday, that includes pre-specified methods, and how you interpret that definition in the context of having to make these decisions.
I think that in terms of the pre-specified, I think that's where sort of this on-the-ground experience, applying it to environmental health topics, thinking about sort of across evidence types, where I think it's not as easy to describe the best available evidence a priori all the time, and then to have sort of this broad mandate for health outcomes. And so I think that just it was immobilizing. It's immobilizing to think a priori describe every conceivable outcome on a massive literature when you're looking at animal, human, mechanistic information. Immobilizing. So the only way we could get past that was to embrace this concept of iterative. Come out with one that has your best thoughts on what you plan to do. You make changes, you update the protocol. You can make it available. And then again, in the draft assessment, which undergoes public comment, peer review, you have opportunities to clarify where things were not clear.
And on a meta level, we do have, and Vicki was just there, we are developing a process also to just capture also what we think are probably pivotal decisions as well. So not only is it captured there, but sort of for posterity, because we will get FOIA'd, we will get challenged, we want to make sure that we have captured the micro big damn deal decisions. So they're not global, they're at that micro local spot, but they make a pivotal impact on the direction. So we have a decision tracking tool that's tracking that as well.
So like decisions about what studies to include in an analysis, would that be tracked in this tracking mechanism, and is that available, or would that be on the protocol?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we would have, so for chloroform, which was a fairly smallish evidence base, we outlined a PICO in the assessment plan in September. We didn't get any public comments that indicated the change was needed to PICO, so we screened studies. And this is where, so in the protocol, the first posting, we actually had have the screening decisions. So we can tell our community, these were the ins, these were the outs, these are the supplemental material. So I would think that, you could argue that that's a result, but because of our need to share with our community very early on the studies that we're focusing on, it just seems to be most effectively done through the protocol.
But if as a result of that there was a decision, for example, that we were not going to do PK modeling, let's say, even though there may be a lot of passion around, we have a strong PK modeling community, and we decided not to PK model. So in addition to that decision being captured in the protocol, we do a lot of work around internally what were the debates that went on and why was that decision made. And that's documented and captured, because when it's that controversial inside of our group, we know it's going to be extremely controversial external too. So we do a sort of a robustness analysis of that, document that decision, senior people jump in, and we own it, even if it is controversial. Yeah. So really double down on documenting.
And actually, we have one we're wrestling with at the assessment plan phase, and not the protocol phase, where the pharmacokinetic work, it's probably adding about 3 to 4 months of our time to sort of develop the assessment plan, because we're proposing a decision based on sort of this kind of analysis.
And we know it's going to be controversial, so we're really, really documenting.
Okay, let me check with the committee and see if we have any more questions. This is sort of your last chance. No means no here. Left side, right side. No. Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for terrific presentations from the agency and for your very thoughtful answers to sometimes challenging questions.